Hello everyone, it's Mr. Fraser again, giving you a quick tutorial here. I want to remind you before we start that these are unscripted, and because of that you're going to hear me make mistakes and sound silly at times, and that's part of the fun of this. If you have any questions or you need anything reviewed, remember you can rewind this, pause this, do whatever you need to get the notes you need or the understanding that you need. And of course you can always come up and ask me in class as well. So today we're going to talk about a short colonial, we want to edit our thing here, colonial history of South America. So we are really talking about the settlement of Native Americans. I'm going to write that down for you. The settlement of Native Americans until the independence of the countries in South America in the late 19th century. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the earliest history of South America. We have to talk about the Ice Age. And no, not the movie. We're going to be talking about the real Ice Age, the last major Ice Age to hit Earth significantly around 30,000 BC. Between 30,000 BC and 10,000 BC, we had large glaciers forming in the northern and southern hemispheres of Earth. So if you can picture the northern and southern portions of Earth, these large glaciers started to cover those portions. And really what it alludes to is like a cup placed into a freezer with water, and as that water freezes you'll get a little bit of ice and a little less water, if you can imagine, and then you will get more ice and then less water until all that's left really is ice. And so what happened is that the glaciers were stealing basically the water for their ice from the oceans. And so what used to be just high points of land underneath the ocean, as the sea levels lowered, these then became land bridges where people could then simply walk over, and yay. And so what happened is early people actually would migrate over from Asia to North America, from what we would know as Russia to Alaska today. This is called the Bering Strait, the Bering Land Bridge. And please, if you're watching on YouTube and then Google it, I'm going to spell this wrong, so please forgive me. So the earliest people migrated between 30,000 BC to 10,000 BC. So that's a 20,000 year period of people just slowly moving from one continent to another. And as they did this, they were most likely moving following herds of animals that they were hunting. By 11,000 BC, which is 1,000 years before the end of the Ice Age, humans had reached all the way to the southern tip of Chile in South America. So they reached all the way to the other pole of the Earth. When the Ice Age ends in 10,000 BC, those people who had gotten to Alaska became trapped because the water level with the melting ice raised, and what was a bridge disappeared beneath the sea, and now the people who had migrated were separated from each other. Rats. So they were stuck in North America or stuck in Asia, and there was no more contact between the people of North America and Asia for thousands of years. Not hundreds, but thousands of years, and that will play significantly into our story. And so Asia, Afro-Eurasia, as you learned earlier in the year, and the Americas, North America / South America, we can abbreviate that as well, became separate and developed separately. So this land bridge between Asia and the Americas was right here This is where the Bering Land Bridge was, and they went through Alaska down into here. Oop, I apologize. Down into here, down all the way down to the southern tip of here by 11,000 BC. Pretty significant stuff. So let's talk about these early people. The people in North America slowly migrated south about 11,000 BC. They had reached all the way down to southern South America and Chile. And that's where our story remains stagnant, the same, for almost 12,400 years. For the rest of our story, we have to go back to Europe, to the Iberian Peninsula, the modern countries of Spain and Portugal. So let's take a look. Spain and Portugal, two countries that border each other. France to the north, the Mediterranean Sea to the east, the Atlantic Ocean to the west, and Morocco to the south. Northern Africa is to the south. These two countries began leading the age we know as the Age of Exploration, which we're about to discuss next. So let's take a look. Europeans began to develop after the end of the Dark Ages a thirst for spices and goods from Asia. Items like nutmeg and cinnamon and even pepper. In addition to things like silk, these luxury items were only available from Asia at the time. Foods from Europe, mainly as a result of the Dark Ages and the lack of trade and things like that. Foods from Asia were very, very bland, and so these spices that livened their taste buds, I guess, became very, very popular and very, very valuable. If you remember our supply and demand chart, supply demand, obviously when the supply is very low, the price is very high. This is your price, this is your supply. And so these spices that were all the way in Asia were very, very valuable. The problem is that there were Muslim empires between Asia and Europe that were unfriendly with the European traders, and this was as a result of the Crusades and, in general, Christian and Muslim wars with each other, and those wars you'll learn about in 8th grade. The Europeans began to want these spices and these goods so much that they began to actually develop new sailing techniques. If we can't trade with them, we will go around them, was the mentality. So they began to learn the ways of the wind and how to construct ships, which is missing from our slide here. So there are two different countries that lead the way. One of them is Portuguese and one of them is the Spanish. So let's talk about the Portuguese first. The son of the King of Portugal, Prince Henry, when fighting a war in northern Africa against Moorish kingdoms, which are Muslim kingdoms, began to develop a taste for the exotic items from Asia, and he basically created a school for navigation. So a school for sailing is what he did, and they developed. They perfected designs of ships from northern Europe. One of them was the Caravel, and basically just began to slowly creep their way around the coast of Africa. The knowledge that was gained by Prince Henry and his sailors led in 1488 AD to Bart Diaz, the Portuguese captain, reaching beyond the tip of Africa, a major achievement for Europeans, sailing thousands of miles from home within the open ocean, something that hadn't been done before. After Diaz came Vasco da Gama. Only 10 years later, he was able to sail all the way to India. Thus began the Portuguese control of much of the coast of Africa and into India and the East Indies is what we would call them today. So the Portuguese had a firm grip on the eastern hemisphere in sailing. Their navy obviously would grow with these trading ships, and the control of the oceans fell to them. So then we turn to the Spanish, who, like the Portuguese, had been fighting Muslim forces, except the Spanish had been fighting Muslim Moors and trying to remove Muslim kingdoms from the Spanish homeland, and they had been fighting for hundreds of years. And every year they fought, they were fighting to spread Catholicism and to unite the people of Spain under one monarch, one king and queen. And they were finally able to do that in 1491, defeating the Moors in southern Spain. 1 year later, Christopher Columbus was able to convince the king and queen of Spain that he could find the wealth or find a way to sail west from Spain to Asia, and by sailing west around the earth, he could actually reach India. Now, some things about Christopher Columbus we want to dispel right now is he knew, and so did his sailors, all of them did, that the earth was not flat, that the earth was round. He knew that, his sailors knew that. That's why they sailed west. Now, maybe the more uneducated farmer wouldn't have known this, but the vast majority of sailors, well, all sailors at that point would have had that knowledge. His assumption, though, was that the Earth was very small compared to what it really is, and that's why he, didn't have any idea about the Americas. In 1492, sailing west, right about to run out of supplies, he stumbles into the Caribbean and discovers what we now know as the Americas. This here is this ship called the Caravel. Okay, the Caravel was a, and again, my spelling is horrible, so trust me that it's called the Caravel, maybe not the spelling. We'll check that a little later. So the Caravel was a small ship, very little underdeck. It was good for basic trading, nice and stout ship. What made it different is it could go in the open ocean, and it was able to be controlled by the rudder here, which allowed it to be steered, and also these large square sails that could be hoisted or lowered depending on the conditions of the wind, allowing them to in effect sail into the wind. They also could be angled to allow them to cut through a wind that was actually going in the wrong direction. So let's take a look at these Portuguese journeys. We have first Henry the Navigator, who with his school and his own fleet explored the northern reaches of the western African coast. Then after him we had Bartholomew Diaz, who explored this stretch here just past the tip of Africa before he had to turn around. And then lastly we had Vasco da Gama, who after a short stay in western Africa swung way out to catch these winds that we know as the westerlies, that would blow them back around Africa, and then sailed up the African coast exploring until he cut across to India. These three men were almost single-handedly responsible for the Portuguese ability to grow their empire. So, let's continue. In 1492, Columbus discovers the Caribbean and the American continents. From that point on, Europeans would sail over to the Americas in search of wealth and conversion. Wealth and conversion. So gold and religion. And so this is where our story begins. Gold and religion. Now, there was a problem, though, with the narrative of Columbus. Before Columbus firmly laid claim to where he landed, way down here, um, a Portuguese captain by the name of Cabral, actually by accidentally trying to catch those winds which went east, actually sailed too far west and actually stumbled into what we now know as Brazil. What this caused was a controversy in the Iberian Peninsula between Spain and Portugal. Spain was attempting to claim all of the Western Hemisphere. Portugal claimed it as well because of this captain who stumbled into Brazil. So an agreement had to be reached. The agreement became known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. What the Pope, along with the King, Queen of Spain, and the Portuguese King, decided that they would split the earth. Yes, I know, split the earth. Everything east of 270 leagues west of Cape Verde, a line would be established. So basically they took Cape Verde, they measured 270 leagues, and they drew a line in the earth. Everything to the east, everything to the west, the Spanish could have, and everything to the east, the Portuguese could have. Now we could see already that this wouldn't last forever, but that in 1494 was how they saw the world. Everything to the east of the line, Portuguese, everything to the west would be Spanish. And that's basically because of that accidental journey into Brazil. And the border of Brazil would expand over the years, and with explorations into the interior, they would claim more and more. But in general, those lines held. And so what we see today is that Spanish South America was pretty much all of this. And Spanish actually controlled all of Mexico, most of Florida, and all this here too, and all these islands for quite some time until other countries became involved. Those other countries that became involved were the British in what we now know as the United States, the French in what we now know as this here, Haiti, and this region here. The Dutch got involved in this region here called Guyana. And then we're going to ignore the Russians for now. They were up here in Alaska for a while. And then the British became involved in Central America here, and also down here in Guyana as well after the Dutch. So what we have in effect is the Native Americans who crossed over during the Barren Land Bridge were being split up by these European countries. These European countries, without consulting these Native Americans, decided who would control who. So let's talk about their motivation. Why did they come? The Spanish came for gold, silver, and that was their intention. They would mine for wealth. In addition, they would come for religion. We could add that as well. You got to remember their motivation for religion is very strong. They had fought for hundreds of years against Muslims. Their entire society was built on attacking others and spreading their religion. That's what the Spanish identity was built on early on. And then we have the Portuguese, who came for Brazil wood, sugar, coffee, and again, religion. So the Portuguese get their money, get their wealth from these colonies by growing. So these are farms. And the Spanish get theirs by mining. In both these industries, okay? In both these industries, we have an increase in a need for large amounts of slaves. These large amounts of slaves will become a problem, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So, Spain and Portugal again, so I apologize. So, in both cases, these European colonies are establishing large plantations for growing coffee and sugar, both the Spanish and the Portuguese. They're mining gold and silver. They need lots of workers. And so originally what they do is they actually will force Native Americans into working on the plantations and in the mines. They basically make the Native Americans into slaves. The problem is that the Native Americans, I'm just going to write N-A, died. If you can remember back to when I said they were separated, this is North America, South America, the Americas were separated from Europe, Asia, and Africa for thousands of years. When diseases developed in the old world, Afro-Eurasia, those Native Americans living in the New World didn't develop ways to fight those diseases. So when contact was made, the Native Americans' bodies didn't know how to fight these diseases, and they died from simple colds and flus and other diseases that the Europeans survived from, and that the Europeans' bodies could get over. And so the Native American population plummeted. And so they needed to replace the Native Americans who died or ran away back into the interior. And so they bought and traded African slaves from West Africa. In particular, they took slaves from the Portuguese-held territory we looked at earlier. What ended up emerging was a need to justify this slavery of African Americans and Native Americans. And so colonial society in South America became based on race. The color of your skin and the color of your skin and where you were born became very important to your ability to exist in society. So impacts on the Native Americans, let's quickly talk about this. We already mentioned this, that huge amounts would die from disease. They had no immunity. And also their religion was taken away and replaced by Roman Catholicism. We want to remember that the Spanish and earlier the Portuguese had received independence for themselves. By fighting religious wars. They fought wars against Muslims, and it was part of their identity, and it was part of the way in which they had existed for so long. In South America, in particular the Spanish South America, the Peninsulares, a class system began to emerge. And basically what this is who you are in society and where you sit. We can rank these in terms of the strongest to the weakest. So those with the most power and those with the least. Strongest, weakest, and that way. So we have the Peninsulares. They're at the top. They are number one in society. These are the people who are Spanish, born in Spain, right off the boat. They have the most power. Part of the reason is they're the ones with money enough to come over, and with education in Europe, which is seen as better. And often the Peninsulares are at the top of society simply because the belief that because they are from Europe, they are better. Many of them owned the majority of the land because the king or the royal family had granted them the land in Spanish-held South America. Beneath them were the Spaniards who were born in the Americas, the immigrant families. These are the people and individuals who were not necessarily poor or any poorer than Peninsulares, but rather their parents had them in Spanish South America, whether it was what became Mexico or Chile. And so these are the sons and daughters of Peninsulares, and they inherited the Peninsulares' land and therefore also the wealth. So early on, the wealth was all in hands of people coming from Spain Later on, the wealth was in the hands of those who were born of pure European heritage, but were born in the Americas. Next came the mestizos. These are those of mixed race. So these are the children of Spanish men and native women, and it wouldn't have gone the other way because women who came over from Europe were very prized, of course, because people wanted people were concerned about their position in society, which revolved around race. And so children of Spanish men and native women were very common because there were very few women, especially early on in Spanish South America. And these people began to have a limited opportunity for land ownership, which revolved around how many ancestors they had of Spanish origin and how many they had of Native American origin. The more Europeans in your background, the more power you had. The less Europeans in your background, the less power you had. And this limited your opportunity in society. At the very bottom, the weakest were Native Americans and African slaves, who had little to no land ownership. However, unlike in the USA or the British colonies, African slave children received freedom. So what does that mean? That means that when when African slaves had children, that next generation of African slaves were free. So this meant something significant. You did have free African people within Spanish South America. This also meant, however, that in Spanish South America and in Portuguese South America, which also allowed for African slave children to have their freedom, they had to import many more African slaves than the United States had to for their slave system to survive, because every generation would go away and you had to import fresh people. As awful as that sounds, more people had to be taken out of Africa, out of their homes, out of their life, and brought into slavery. So though it sounds like a more fair system, it had the significance of actually increasing the amount of people in slavery. So let's talk about independence for South America. We're going to start with the Spanish, and then we'll go to the Portuguese. In both cases, this guy named Napoleon, this little short man from France, well, actually from Corsica, and then which became part of France, gains control of the government and the armies of France and begins to conquer all of Europe, in effect. And he invades Spain and Portugal in 1808. In the South American colonies, because of their home countries being conquered, in effect, are left alone to fend for themselves. What occurs is the Spanish colonies and Portuguese colonies begin to notice that they can exist without their mother countries. And the Spanish colonies and the Portuguese colonies begin to push for independence. So, I know we're going kind of fast. I appreciate you following along. The Spanish colonies, began to question their loyalty to Spain because of Napoleon controlling Spain. In 1810, the Spanish Criollos, which are that middle class of Spanish descent, complete European history, complete European ancestry, but born in South America. They declared independence from South American colonies throughout. They declared independence from Spain throughout the continent. There were two wars in effect that were being fought. One was in the north and one was in the south. The war in the north was being fought by the man Simón Bolívar and to a smaller extent, Francisco de Paula Santander, who was a Colombian. These two men worked together to win independence, though Bolivar gets all the credit because he actually had Santander executed for insubordination. But in effect, they worked together, and their armies were joined together later under Bolivar to conquer, to free Venezuela in 1811. 11 years later, Colombia gained independence, and Ecuador in 1822. From the south came Jose de San Martin, who was from Argentina. He, a much more patient general, was able to miraculously free Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. In the case of South America, getting their independence, these three generals probably played the largest role. But working together, they were able to achieve independence. There were many questions on what to do with these countries that gained independence, whether they should join together like the United States, which had gained independence in 1776, but really 1789 is where they formally created a federal government, or if they should remain independent, which is what they actually did, and we'll talk about that in some detail. So let's take a look at the Portuguese colonies. So the Spanish gained independence through war. The Portuguese did not. So Napoleon gained control of Portugal as well. The royal family actually ran away and stayed in Rio de Janeiro, rebuilt the city as a capital of the Portuguese Empire, and stayed there for 13 years while Napoleon was fighting his wars in Europe. When Napoleon was finally defeated, most of the royal family, including the King of Portugal, returned to Portugal. However, the son of the king, the heir to the throne, Prince Pedro, stayed behind in Rio de Janeiro. Because of pressure from his friends and from his advisors and from the country as a whole, he refused to return to Portugal and refused to return Brazil to Portuguese control, and he declared Brazil independent in 1822. Brazil actually would remain a monarchy under a king until 1889. Prince Pedro became, I'll write it here for you, Dom Pedro the First. Dom Pedro the First. And he actually didn't even serve that long as king. He actually abdicated, gave control to his son, and when his father died, he actually became the king of Portugal. So he was actually the king of Brazil, and then later became, by title, the king of Portugal, which he stepped down from also, and gave control to his daughter Maria. So it's a very interesting history there, with Dom Pedro the First king of Brazil. And so Brazil gains independence by becoming a monarchy, which is, in terms of the Americas, very unique. There's really few other cases where there were monarchies in the American hemispheres. So the Portuguese gained independence through politics, and again, the Spanish through war. And that's really where we're going to leave it off. We'll pick up the history of modern South America soon. Just to review, that we will ask that you rewind this wherever you need to, where you fill out your notes completely. You ask any questions where you're confused. I understand I went fast in some cases. That's the beauty of you being able to rewind. If you have any more questions, please ask. And good luck with you in your next steps. Don't forget to do step 2 and step 3 and 4 of the module. Good luck.